Welcome to Sustainable Kashi's first free permaculture class in our second season. I believe we're into our 20th call, which is pretty exciting. Sustainable Kashi is really proud to be able to host these classes every week. They're here to help us all connect with the ecosystem and each other using permaculture as our foundation. So we are located in Sebastian, Florida on an 80-acre retreat center. Natural beauty right next to the St. Sebastian River. It's really a beautiful site. We have 9 demonstration gardens, volunteer opportunities if you want to get your hands dirty, classes and workshops. So check us out at sustainablekashi.com if you want to learn more. In the Eco Village here, you can explore all the off-grid regenerative systems that kind of get your hands on to really help you learn how to understand them and see how they work. So we hope you can come out for a visit sometime soon. Today, we're so excited to be talking about food forests. And food forests are one of my favorite parts of permaculture, honestly. It's like the idea that this regenerative system can feed us every single day with pretty much little to no inputs from us once we get them established is exciting. And I see that as just a really, really exciting tool. And I see this community as kind of using that same design. It's a food forest where we're all playing different parts. We all have different niches in here. Some of us are old growth trees. Some of us are young understory plants. And I myself, I kind of consider myself a dynamic accumulator because I've been in this thing for so long. I've been able to meet so many wonderful people that I'm able to kind of pull them together. And it's such a gift today to be able to share Greg with the group. And Greg Noonan is a 4th generation farmer. He's from Eastern North Carolina, North Kakalaki, as they say out there. And he moved here in 2015 to join the growing urban agriculture movement and has since helped hundreds of homeowners in the Orlando area take steps towards living more resiliently and abundantly. I personally know Greg, and he's just a great and funny man. He's a great he has a great way of getting the ideas across that we're really trying to portray here with permaculture and community. He's the founder and owner of Connected Landscapes in Orlando. I recommend checking him out. It's a permaculture-inspired landscape design company that in Orlando to help people grow regenerative gardens in their yard. So Greg, thank you for being here. And without further ado, please take us into the world of food forests.
Cool. Hi. Thanks for that introduction, Terry. It's always deeply stressful to try to live up to those expectations, but hopefully we're going to have some cool stuff to share with you today. I was just talking to Amy before we started the call. I think, like many people right now, I'm a little frazzled. I generally, when I do any kind of a presentation, I like to have a kind of a flow to it where it's I kind of present all these ideas and then tie them all together. I'm not certain that's going to happen today. I think if you remember back in high school, the different kinds of essay writing, there's like persuasive essays and narrative essays. This one's just kind of going to be expository. This is just going to be some information, some things that I've been thinking about, some concepts, particularly related to food forestry, kind of the roots of that. So I want to start with this picture here. And I'll also say too, Terry mentioned we've got some people calling from other places. This is going to be heavily Florida centric in terms of the kind of practical examples that I'm giving. But I think there's still probably benefit, even if you're not in Florida, to thinking about the same kinds of concepts. And so if you're not familiar with Florida, or even if you are in Florida and you've forgotten what the outside looks like over the last 6 months, this picture is what we would call like a pine flatwoods or like a pine forest. And this is like basically the entire upland of Florida. So unless you're like by a lake or you're in a swamp or you're by the coast, when we're talking about the just kind of flat plains of Florida, it looks something quite a lot like this. And so I wanted to start off with a picture of what Florida looks like, because we're going to be talking a lot about the ecology of Florida and how our systems interact with that ecology. So we're going to start off too, going way deep. We're going to talk about the history of agriculture. So it's a rich and fascinating subject. And there is a host of conflicting theories about how Homo sapiens started to collect their own food and domesticate plants and animals. And I do not have remotely close to the expertise, and we don't have the time for me to really weigh in to all of that. So I'm going to super duper summarize the prevailing theories on what went down when we started growing our own food really quickly. And I only give that disclaimer because if you like have any kind of anthropological training, you're going to be like, but I'm aware that this is a massive summarization. So around 150,000 years ago, something a whole lot like humans started harvesting cereal grains. We're quite sure the early hominids hunted. We think it's generally accepted, I don't know if this is true because there's some debate on this, but it's generally accepted that a lot of our early calories were coming from meat-based sources, that we were pretty big hunters. But then around 11,700 years ago, so around 12,000 years ago, in what's called the Neolithic age, at the beginning of the Holocene epoch, which is what geologists refer to the kind of time period that we're currently in, our ancestors, which were at that point basically virtually identical to us today, right? They started domesticating foods all over the world simultaneously. It's just kind of started happening globally. And I talked about that in my last talk at Kashi a bit. Hold on just a second. I'm having some cat issues. I have two cats, and they do not often enjoy one another's company, so I apologize for that. Anyway, so Neolithic age, Holocene epoch, right? We started domesticating plants and animals basically globally. And a guy named V. Gordon Childe actually coined that term Neolithic Revolution in 1936 to describe this phenomenon. And I talked about this last time as well. This is probably the most significant thing that's happened in all of human history. Like our move from whatever we were to an agricultural society is kind of still to this day, even though we don't necessarily think of ourselves as agricultural societies anymore, it's kind of still the most transformative moment in all of human history, because we started to actively engage with the ecology of the world around us in a way that we had never done before. And there's a whole bunch of theories as to why this happened, but we don't really know. So the general feeling is that there was tremendous change in climate around 12,000 years ago. There's not really consensus on what those changes were. Some people say it got colder, some people say it got wetter, some people say it got hotter, some people say it got drier. What we know is that it changed, and that change led to humans traveling less. So we had been pretty nomadic. If you don't know this, humans are actually the best distance runners on the planet. We think that's one of the reasons that we were so good at hunters, but for whatever reason, we ended up kind of condensing our populations and started to rely much more heavily on a plant-based diet. And there's a theory about all this that says that we were kind of forced into oases, sort of naturally lush areas in the equatorial regions of Africa and Asia and I guess Southern Europe. I'm not that good at geography. And that we just kind of condensed into these naturally lush places, and that as a consequence of us and other herbivore mammals being condensed in these tight spaces, we kind of got used to each other, and then we figured out that some of those animals were delicious, and then we domesticated them, and we also figured out some of them laid eggs and we could use those. And that's kind of how we got to where we are now. There's another theory that says that these kind of early proto-tribes, that the chiefs of these tribes, I love this theory because it seems so relevant to kind of the world that we live in today. I don't know if I believe it, but it's a great theory that these early chiefs would just throw these crazy huge feasts to kind of just declare themselves like dominant, and that the like subject humans would like panic because there wasn't actually enough food for this to work. So they started growing it so that the chief wouldn't kill them all because he couldn't throw his feasts. Again, I don't know if I believe that, but I think it's a great story. The theory that sort of fits my narrative today, because really at some level what we're talking about is just sort of serving narratives, because there's kind of an equal amount of evidence for all of these things, was advanced by a guy named David Rindos. And he says that basically what happened is that we were living in forested regions for whatever reason, again, and that we kind of just started noticing that some things were more useful, some plants were more useful than other species of plants, and some animals as well. And that we were looking, and we kind of edited these forests that we were living in, right? So let's just say, we're talking about equatorial regions. Let's say we figured out we could eat bananas. Some bananas, as we all know, are more delicious than other bananas. So we were naturally kind of drawn to those bananas, and we'd eat them, and then they'd reseed. and we'd kind of neglect the ones that weren't delicious. And so those would kind of decline. And so over time, we sort of manipulated the genetics of our surroundings to more serve our needs, right? And then over time, we kind of got away from native flora. I think it was Philip that just was talking about the native, all the native fruit trees and like the prickly pears that you're growing in Florida. We're going to talk about that at length. I'm happy that you brought that up, that kind of approach to food forestry. But basically what happened is that after we had sort of, quote, mastered that, we moved into kind of picking things from other places. Maybe there was some trade with other tribes. We kind of started to figure out that cereal grains were a little easier to harvest in mass. And one, two, skip a few, we have combines and 12,000 acres of corn, right? So what all of those theories all agree on, again, is just that climate changed, we stopped hunter-gathering, we stopped being nomadic, and that this all happened in kind of the equatorial regions called the Levant, which is basically the Middle East, plus or minus the Mediterranean, around 12,000 years ago. So why does any of this matter? What does any of this have to do with food forests? We talk about food forests a lot in permaculture circles. Like I would say that of the Facebook threads that I ever see on social media, 99% of them are ... my food forest, or my food forest ... right? So we talk about this a lot. And what I want to talk about today, again, in just sort of a broad expository way, are some of the things that I've learned over the years doing research, learning more from permaculturalists here in Florida like Terry, and some of the sort of just poke at some of our biases, some of our assumptions about the way that these systems work, and hopefully make it easier for us to design better systems. So if I can get my screen, there we go. So what are we going to learn today? We're going to talk about 3 key things, right? And I'm just going to say them out loud. People tell me that I'm good at presenting, but I often feel like people just kind of leave going like, well, that guy was really animated, but I'm not sure that I understood anything that he said. So I'm just going to say the 3 things that I mean to say out loud now, and then wherever we end up, like hopefully it was useful to somebody. So here's the three key points, right? The first one is forest gardening isn't necessarily unique to permaculture, right? This is an idea that our movement kind of learned from other people and cultures. And then what's interesting is that it's super ancient, but we moved away from it, right? So why did that happen? And then why are we now moving back to it? So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is, if you want to understand how to design a good food forest, you need to understand forests, just plain old forest, right? Because a food forest is sort of an even more complex version of native ecology, which is already unbelievably complex. When I went through my PDC with Terry, we were sitting in the, whatever the wilderness around Kashi is called. I can't remember what it's called, but we were just kind of sitting out in the forest. And Terry said something that I think about all of the time. We were just sort of sitting around looking at the ground, basically, at all the kind of lichens and plants and things that were regrowing. They had just done a controlled burn. And Terry said, I could sit here and look at this 1 square foot of earth forever, and still not, for the rest of my life, and still not know everything there is to know about what's going on in this 1 square foot. And I think about that all of the time. So to understand our food forest, we need to understand plain old forests pretty well. And then if you understand forests and you understand the kind of ideology behind forest gardening, then what that kind of begs the question of is, what is our role in that forest garden? And what we're going to talk about is disturbance, and how often incredibly destructive processes that occur naturally really result in the most fertility in the short term. So those are going to be the 3 things that we talk about. And if I do a good job of presenting these points, my hope is that you'll have a better understanding of the desirable outcomes when you're planning your own systems, and it'll all make us better gardeners and homesteaders and just sort of generally groovier people. And my central thesis here, just to tell you kind of if there is one point to all of this, my point is, my theory is that the food forest is all about managing disturbance, that's really what we are in the business of doing when we're designing a food forest. And that the state of nature immediately following these disturbances is probably the single most bountiful point in the kind of geological timeline of an ecological system. So if I pull this off, we're going to pull that all back and around, and we're going to talk about how a good food forest takes into account the way that forests actually work. They're rooted in a solid ecological understanding, and they might be the oldest form of human interaction with the planet, deliberate human interaction with the planet that exists. And I think if we spend a little more time understanding that interaction, we might just all be better off for it. Let's see here. So food forest, right? So most of you are familiar with the term food forest, and you're aware that in Florida, at least, it probably looks something like this. It's a densely planted polyculture with multiple levels of plant growth and various techniques to kind of improve soil and reduce inputs, like Terry was talking about earlier. And in ag circles and sort of permaculture discussion, this is often kind of talked about as like pretty bleeding edge stuff, that this is like revolutionary. And it is in the context of our current society, but it's not really. I mean, like, this is a pretty ancient technique. Like, we're rediscovering this in the West. But even then, what you're going to find out is like a lot of people in the West knew about this 200 years ago. Like it's sort of fascinating how long it has taken us to figure out that this may be the most sustainable form of agriculture, given how much our society relies on agricultural commodities. What I'm not going to do, unfortunately, is cover the basics of a food forest. So there's like, I don't know, 100 billion hours of people talking about homesteading techniques and food forest on YouTube. Here in Florida, you can go to tons of really groovy food forests. If you like, go to Kashi once they reopen, if you haven't been. Terry's done some awesome stuff down there. There's Hart Farm in Lake Wales, there's Echo. There's a ton of stuff. Most of you on here probably have better food forests than anything that I could kind of try to describe. So I don't want to talk about like plant selections, but I do think if you're just starting out and you're kind of, you're planning out your systems, or even if you've been doing it for a while, I think hopefully what we'll talk about today will help you shape a little bit of your thinking about how these systems are supposed to work and how we can optimize them a little bit. So again, not going to be talking necessarily about homesteading stuff, some bigger picture stuff, but if you've read any permaculture text, you know that one of the things we do is design patterns to details. So this is a patterns discussion more than a details discussion. I just wanted to kind of mention that. But also, if you aren't familiar with the food forest, this is a great picture of kind of often what that looks like. And now we're going to talk about some other pretty crazy examples of what food forest looks like. We're going to start with the People of Chaga. So this, to me, this picture is amazing because it just looks like Star Wars. Like it's insane, right? Like, I don't even know what any of that is. But what we do know is that the Chaga people live on the southeast slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro. And they've been there for about 500 to 800 years. We know for sure they've been there since the 1800s, which is when sort of white people showed up and documented this culture. And this is from the UN Food and Agricultural Organization. On the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro, the Chaga community, Shimbwe Jew village, much of the area is divided into kihamba, plots of land with a traditional home and garden. Here the kihamba help form, and here's some keywords for you that you might recognize, a multi-layered agroforestry system that boasts over 500 types of plants and is rich in biodiversity. Coffee, yams, bananas, ginger, taro, and cassava, those might also sound familiar, thrive amongst fruit trees that are irrigated even in the dry season by a network of water channels flowing 17 kilometers down the mountainside. So whoa, right? I mean, that's the whole deal. And these people have been here for at least 800 years. Their sort of local tradition, where we know that they don't view Mount Kilimanjaro as their ancestral home. They know they migrated there from another place. It's pretty confusing. Also, another thing that's going to happen throughout this whole talk is every point of this, I could go down a 4-hour rabbit hole on how wild all of this stuff is. So a lot of what I would hope that you would do if any of this is interesting to you is for sure do your own reading, because these people are fascinating. And they're one of the only cultures that I could find really good documentation on for agroforestry systems. So they don't really live in tribes. They live in these kihamba, and like these kihamba are these ancestral forest gardens that have been going for hundreds of years in a lot of cases, at least 500 years again. And relatively speaking, they're one of the wealthiest cultures kind of in this area, because they have an enormous amount of food security. I mean, there's a huge amount of agricultural export that's coming out of this place. This is in Tanzania. If you've ever had Tanzanian coffee, there's like a pretty good chance it came from this group of people. So you can see here on the left, right? If you've ever seen any of in the hillier parts of the country, permaculture farms, you've seen these terraces like this. There they are, right? On the south-facing slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro. This is a little to the west. This is actually the Maasai people, which are kind of culturally neighbors, but they're doing the terrace gardens. They're doing the polyculture. Here you see up in the top right, that is some of the women working in a papaya and coffee orchard. Those tends to be like their major two things, are the papaya and coffee. And when the colonizers showed up originally, they noticed that the whole area, like the sort of nexus of trade and commerce in the area, were these produce markets that were operated almost entirely by women. Super cool. This is a quote from one of those women. "I see three main benefits in our traditional cultivation." And let's see if you can think what three things this aligns perfectly with. "I see three main benefits in our traditional cultivation. We are protecting the environment, we're eating nutritious and organic food, and we have some income through selling produce and animals." You know, that sounds a whole lot to me like Earth Care, People Care, Fair Share. And I promise you that person is not familiar with those three ethics. And I thought that was amazing, that this system is so similar, totally organic, completely different culture. Here's some more pictures of it. That's actually Mount Kilimanjaro. You can see on the red area here, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but that's the actual sort of village proper. And then all these farms just kind of go up through here. So like in the darker part, that's where they're doing most of the coffee. Down in here, in the lighter part where there's a little bit less tree cover, that's where there's like more of the herbaceous stuff and kind of fruit trees. And then you can see that they're using basically the melted ice channels that kind of just stream off the top of Mount Kilimanjaro to irrigate all of this. This on the left is, it's a half a mile long by a quarter mile wide place that I found just sort of looking around of those terraced fruit tree gardens. You can't quite see it at this resolution, but like in between those rows of trees are, I mean, every single contour there, you know, probably to 3 feet of fall, there's a terrace. Unbelievable stuff. It's super cool. And again, this is probably one of the most well-documented cultures that's done this for whatever reason, because the UN is particularly interested in what's going on here. But this is another really interesting. Inraren, if you're familiar with Jeff Lawton, the kind of heir apparent to the permaculture, the Australian permaculture dynasty, I guess. He was apprenticed to, I think, directly to Bill Mollison. This is where he says he kind of got turned on to this whole thinking. This is in Morocco. You can see that's the coastline of Morocco. And then it's inland a little ways. It's a surf spot. He was a surfer. And him and his friends kind of trekked in a bit to this little village. And there was this lush, beautiful orchard. And he was like, well, what's going on here? And the locals told him that it was 2,000 years old. There is zero documentation about this place. Like Jeff Lawton is the only person you can find talking about it. The government of Morocco's website kind of talks about ancestral forest gardens, which I thought was interesting, but it doesn't really mention any specifics. So Jeff's just about our only piece of information under here, but he was like, it was crazy, you know, like we're in the desert, but it was cool and moist, and there were all these different plants. And I just thought, holy smokes. And so here you can see it. So it's a date palm overstory. Then there's a ton of bananas under that. And then in the video where he kind of talks about it, he was interviewed in the 90s. He rattles off, you know, probably 24 more species of plants because he ended up finally going back and kind of doing some research there. But it's farmed by as many as 800 people in this village, 2,000 years old, right? Super insane. So that is another great example of an old food forest, one of the oldest probably that we have any leads on. And then here is where it gets really crazy. There is a study out of Exeter University in England that suggests that the Amazon rainforest, which is what you see zigzagging up there on the top right corner, is about 45,000 years old, and that it's mostly cultivated. That what we're seeing now was deliberate, or at least influenced by human beings. There's an enormous amount of biodiversity, as we all know, right? But when they're doing this research, so I'll be perfectly transparent. The paper is behind a paywall, which is no paper should be, and I didn't want to pay $200 to read the paper. I do want to pay $200 to read the paper, but I didn't. So I don't know exactly what their conclusions are, but these researchers, a team of about 6 or 7 grad students, went over to the Amazon and kind of surveyed the biodiversity and basically arrived at the conclusion that there's no way that this could have happened naturally, that the species are too dense, they're too novel in terms of their appeal to human beings. So what they are suggesting is that, I believe, the Mayan people basically either deliberately or sort of semi-deliberately created massive food forests that now constitute a huge percentage of the Amazon. Super crazy. And so there's these food forests kind of all over the world that are completely unconnected to each other. They're all practicing some version of multi-layered polyculture farming and techniques to improve the soil and capture rainwater. And it's just, I mean, I think that's fascinating. There's these cultures exist in Sri Lanka. Yeah, there's stuff in India. And again, the biggest problem that I had, and something that I want to continue doing, is looking into the history of these techniques, because what you find when you start doing history on forest gardening is that basically every culture that has even remotely close ties to its ancestral homelands. So in places like India, where there's people have been there for a really long time, South Asia, where people have been there for a really long time, Equatorial Africa, Northern Africa, where people have been there for all of them say, you can find all of these cultures saying, oh yeah, we forest garden for, millennia. This is just always how we've done things. But for some reason, there's just not a ton of good anthropological research about it. And so the reason that I wanted to point all these out is there's 2 reasons, really. I think the first reason is that I really want to talk more about these international farming techniques and indigenous people's farming techniques, and acknowledge the heritage of humanity really learning how to work with our environment. I just think that's amazing, right? We get really caught up in our own kind of, or at least I do, our European farming traditions, but there's this stuff that's happening all over the world. It's been happening for hundreds of years, and it's amazing. These people are living in an unbelievable amount of harmony with the natural world in unbelievably hostile environments, right? And the second reason that I wanted to point this out is that, so these are generally pretty inhospitable places, right? The Amazon has unbelievable seasonal monsoons and floods, and Morocco is in that's the high desert. Sri Lanka, you're talking about deep, hard frosts. Kilimanjaro is a super volcano. So these are all places that are not necessarily Shangri-La. These are places where these systems must have been developed partially to address the fact that what else could you have done? Right? It would have been difficult to live in these places that are lush, that have the climate, that have the resources, but certainly you couldn't just be growing, sort of tractor plowed cereal grains, right? Really interesting stuff. And so that's kind of some of the ancient history. Let's jump forward a little bit to more recent history, right? So I guess before I get into that, so what bears mentioning, so we know that this has been going on for thousands of years, right? Basically every agriculturalist agrees that the oldest form of gardening is forest gardening. There's very little documentation about it, but why did we move away from that? I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, is if this is such a perfect system, then what happened? And this is, we'll talk more about this in depth later. I suspect what happens, we all know about slash and burn agriculture, and we kind of, that's generally viewed through a pretty negative lens, that it's once the slash and burn agriculture started, that's when everything kind of went downhill, right? And there's some merit to that. I mean, that was even sort of a prevalent attitude at the time based on some interpretations of Sumerian myth about agriculture. But there must have been a reason they were doing it. And I think one of the reasons they were doing it, so the commonly accepted reason is you burn down all the trees and you have more light, so your cereal grains do better. And these were cultures that were dependent on cereal grains. That's certainly part of it. But if you've ever been into a forest after a forest fire, you will notice that there is a tremendous amount of life. And we're going to talk about nutrient cycling as well. I think it does a massive disservice to these early agricultural societies to suggest that they didn't observe what was happening following a forest fire and go, well, two birds, one stone, right? We're going to eliminate a lot of shade, and we're also going to cycle nutrients. They might not have known exactly what was happening, but I think they knew, why it was a effective farming technique from a certain perspective. And then, of course, in the 60s, following the advent of the process for creating synthetic nitrogen that I can never remember the name of, the Haber-Bosch process, maybe, where we figured out how we can make synthetic nitrogen. They call that the Green Revolution, which I think is so amazing, where we started to develop all these chemag inputs and mechanization. We, triple and quadruple and septuple and dodecuple our production globally, right? Like suddenly our corn is huge, right? And it's producing these massive tonnages of produce and of grain and of fuel and all of this stuff. And everybody goes, this is amazing. I mean, this is the future, right? Like we don't have to slave and pull out weeds and do all of the, till things back under and let the field sit fallow. We can just go nuts. And for a while that worked. And now we're kind of coming to the place where we're realizing that there was massive disruption to the natural systems that would have provided fertility in the places where these chemag processes were being used. And so enter these guys that you see on the screen in front of you, who sort of started figuring out that maybe not only was there a better solution, maybe it was a solution that we used to use. And it all kind of starts with that book that you see in the middle. It's J. Russell Smith's Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture. And you can see I put the picture of Bill Mollison up here on the right, smiling at that book, because it's a lot, I think, of what shaped his thinking. I haven't read it yet. It is in the mail. But we're going to start in a different place. We're going to start in England with a farmer named Robert Hart. And he's down there on the left. He looks like J.R.R. Tolkien. These guys all are just the best. I'm sure these guys were a trip to talk to. And this guy's a farmer. I believe he was I can't remember, World War I or II veteran, but this guy's getting a little long in the tooth. And he's realizing that farming is kind of a lot of work. Like he's growing all these vegetables and it's kind of a nightmare. I mean, he's got to plow, he's got to fertilize, he's got to do all these things. And then he looks and he sort of sees this messy little herb garden that he kind of just threw over in the side of his yard. And he's like, well, I don't ever have to do anything to that. And that grows all the time. So what's up with that? And he starts to observe the natural environment around him. And he realizes pretty quickly that, like, well, nobody gardens the forest either for the most part. And it seems to do mostly fine. So what am I kind of missing? He comes across this same book and also the teachings of this guy in the top left. His name is Tokyo. Let's see. No, not Tokyo. Where is his name? Toyohiko Kagawa. And he gets really excited about this guy. And this guy was a Japanese farmer who is a fascinating person. This guy's kind of a whole topic unto himself, but he basically had the same conclusion. He was like, why are we spending so much energy on these systems that seem to be actively getting worse, that are depleting topsoil, that are eliminating fertility? Why we didn't do this before, so why are we doing it now? Robert Hart coins the term forest gardening. And today, still in England, it's kind of his lineage, to use sort of a spiritual teacher term, right? Like it's his guruship that has a whole lineage in England of forest gardeners. This guy down here in the bottom right, Masanobu Fukuoka, if you have not read One Straw Revolution, cannot recommend it enough. It will blow your mind. This guy, same thing, kind of a wandering, sort of odd outsider kind of guy, which is a pretty common theme with these guys. He also equally disenchanted with life. He goes back to his like family farm and he basically says like, all right, well, I'm a Zen Buddhist. I'm going to apply Zen Buddhist principles to farming. And he calls it do nothing farming. And he basically just sort of says, okay, well, how little can I do here? And what he finds, much to the surprise of even the government of Japan, is that the less he does, or the more, I guess what would be more accurate to say is the more deliberately he removes inputs from his system, the more successful it is. And he gets some things wrong. Again, I absolutely recommend this book. Well, Bill Mollison, Australian farmer, also an outsider, also a guy who doesn't want to break his back farming, finds out about this guy in this book, and then creates permaculture, right? So this is, again, what I think is, again, fascinating. This all kind of happens from the 30s to the 60s. So hundreds of years later, right, we have these ancestral forms of gardening all over the world. Hundreds of years later, these guys all arrive, again, spontaneously at basically the same conclusion. I think that's such a testament to how obviously this is something that has some real power to it. But what I think is also interesting is that these men, and generally the modern permaculture movement, really focus on the harmonious, the kind of the groovy, the peaceful aspects of like kind of, we're going to create these systems that are self-generating and we're not going to ever have to do anything to them. And I think what we have neglected, not necessarily as a result of any of their writing, because they all kind of talk about this in their own works, but what we've neglected is that there is another side to natural systems that is much less harmonious, that there are wildfires, there are landslides, there are hurricanes, and that these systems rely to some degree on some of these less harmonious elements. And there's I think as a consequence of our current agricultural paradigm, we're really invested in kind of keeping things the same. And I think we want to believe that part of our role as environmentalists is to protect the earth exactly as it is right now forever. But what we're going to talk about now is how that's not really how ecology works. It's not really how it's ever worked. So now we're going to talk about forests, right? As I said, the second point that I wanted to get across is how do forests actually work, right? This is a picture of that kind of classic Floridian flatlands forest. You could see there's well, this is probably mostly slash pine, but ideally it would be longleaf pine. And then you have kind of some dotted scrubby stuff underneath there, maybe a cabbage palm, and then virtually a saw palmetto monoculture. And then what you'll often see too, kind of on the borders of those saw palmettos, you'll see blueberries and stuff. But this is basically the way that Florida works. Those gentlemen that I just had on the screen, a lot of them arrive at that sort of 7-layer agroforestry principle. They were all pretty excited about that, where you have an overstory, and then you have an understory, and then you have a shrub layer, and then you have an herb layer, and then I think you have a vine layer and a root layer. I might have missed one in there, but that's generally how they work out how a forest works. When you look at this, you actually see that it doesn't really have those layers at all, but it has layers, but it's not those perfect tiered 7 tiers that we talk about in permaculture a lot. And that's kind of what I want to touch on a little bit here, is how there are different kinds of forests and how we should be understanding different ecological systems, how to incorporate some of the wisdom from those systems into our own designs, right? So what's the definition of a forest? It's a large tract of land covered with trees and underbrush, semicolon, woodland. Wikipedia says it's a forest is an area of land dominated by trees. Hundreds of definitions of forest are used throughout the world, incorporating factors such as tree density, tree height, and land use, legal standing, and ecological function. And so generally the way that I understood how kind of nature works, like sort of the life cycle of a forest, is through this model of ecological succession. And what I'm pretty sure what I was actually taught, I don't know if I just intuited this or if I heard it on like Bill Nye or something, but was this idea that you kind of start with, like, there's a fire, and then you have your pioneer species, and then your pioneer species are like, you know, like your mosses or like your little scrubby kind of undergrowth stuff. That kind of turns into grasses, and then grasses kind of turn into shrubs, and then shrubs kind of turn into a pine forest, and then eventually the whole world, if but only we humans were to leave it alone, the whole world would become basically a live oak overstory. And that's probably, like, this picture is basically probably in your mind how this process works. Like, and maybe not, maybe you have never had this problem, but I definitely did. And this was transformative to my thinking, that what we have learned is that that's not necessarily the case. So this guy right here, his name is, what is his name? I have written down Frederick Clemens, right? So originally, a guy named Adolphe Dureau de la Malle was the first to use the term succession, specifically in reference to the way vegetation regrew after clear cutting. And then Henry David Thoreau actually also talks about this a little bit. He wrote a paper called The Succession of Forest Trees, in which he described the succession of an oak pine forest. But the Climax community, which is probably a term you've heard before, which is the term that we used for a long time for those oak forests, that was coined by this gentleman. His name is Frederick Clemens. He looks very serious. And he kind of advanced this notion. He was a big fan of it. And basically his theory was that all natural systems approach equilibrium, and that equilibrium basically is a hardwood old growth forest. And during his day, this fellow, everything about this guy, I love everything about this guy. Like, I don't know why. I just feel a deep kinship to the man in this picture. Look how many papers this man is holding. That's a lot of papers. I just feel like he's having a tough time. And history sort of suggests that he definitely was having a tough time, because he wrote a whole bunch of papers about how he disagreed with Clemens and nobody cared. He was a botanist. His name's Henry A. Gleason. So he basically wrote a dissenting paper that said, no, it's not quite that simple. Like, vegetation definitely has succession. We know that for sure. But it's so multivariate, and there's so many different ways that succession happens depending on a whole variety of pressures and factors. We can't really say that natural equilibrium is just an old growth forest. What we kind of have to say is that equilibrium is specific to, who knows how granular we can get with this, that maybe even within a forest that is an oak forest, we have, patches within that have arrived at a different equilibrium that isn't an oak overstory, right? And so basically what happens is, in the 50s, a couple of guys pick up this guy's work, and they do way more, their names are Robert Whitaker and John Curtis. They go way more into depth with this theory. They do tons of field research, and they go, yeah, no, I think this guy's right. I think it's a little more complicated than that simple model of succession. And so what does this have to do with food forests, right? So part of the implicit assumption in a lot of forest gardens design is a state of equilibrium, that like, we're going to plant a forest and eventually it's going to require virtually nothing from us. And I think that's true. I mean, Terry said that at the beginning of the call. I think that is definitely true relative to industrial agriculture, which requires tremendous constant input, right? But, and observationally, that makes sense, right? So like, if you're in a submesic hammock, which would be kind of where we have our oaks in Florida, these are places that are protected from fire. They're usually, sort of surrounded by swamps or something. You see that sort of food forest pattern. You see the oaks, and then you've got kind of your pop ash and maple. And then under that, maybe you have your bay species like your red bay and your swamp bays and all that. And then under that, you have a bunch of scrubby shrubs that I've never bothered to learn the names of. And then under that, you have more stuff, and you have vines, you have Virginia creeper and smilax, and you have that full 7-tiered system, right? But then there's like all kinds of systems in Florida that are clearly at a natural equilibrium that aren't that. So this is a picture of the Everglades, right? The generally accepted consensus is that there will not come a time for, I mean, maybe in millennia, but not anywhere in the kind of human scope of time that this becomes an old growth forest. Like, that is relatively in a state of equilibrium as a grassy wetland. Another example of a modern, what they call a climax community, that term still gets used even though it's not quite as scientifically accepted as it once was, is actually these stovepipe cactus deserts out in like Arizona and New Mexico. They go, well, that's it. This is this at full maturity. And it's not a hardwood forest. So, but the thing that's the same is that these are still thousands of species that are densely intermingled, right? It's a huge amount of biodiversity. The Everglades, there are people managing now because of all kinds of catastrophic things that are happening to it. But like, the desert is a great example of a spot that nobody's really taking care of that. I mean, they're preventing it from being turned into housing developments, but that's kind of just rolling on its own. It takes care of itself. It's a natural system. And I think the takeaway there for me, at least, is when we're designing systems, there are relationships beyond old growth forests that are meaningful, right? We shouldn't discount those. And what's also interesting are the mechanisms that create those different forms of succession, right? So why doesn't everything succeed the same way? Why are there different kinds of disturbances? And now we're going to get into the really controversial stuff. We're going to talk about disturbance. And so for the sake of brevity, I'm again mostly going to focus on Florida. I imagine most of you are probably from Florida. So like, I don't know what goes on in Canada other than what seems like generally everything being slightly better. But I do know that it's cold, so I would imagine you have big issues with freezes. I mean, I'm sure that there are things like there are still glaciers in part of Canada, I believe. Even on the East Coast in the United States, you know, you have sort of more pronounced wet, dry cycles, you have landslides, you have hurricanes. There's a lot of disturbances. In Florida, though, our major source of disturbance is fire, historically speaking, right? So I have heard from a local naturalist that historically speaking, so like prior to any kind of European settlement, probably even prior to indigenous settlement, that 95% of Florida would have been on fire at any given time. I don't know if that's true. That's crazy to think about though, because that would have been truly a massive amount of fire. And the reason that's true, the reason that we believe that to be true geologically, beyond like the sediment layers and everything, is that Central Florida is the lightning strike capital of the US. I believe we're in the running for the world. And the reason for that is that there are two currents that basically clash right over Florida. And when those two currents clash, they create those giant, huge, beautiful, fluffy storm clouds that we're also fond of, right? And what happens is up in the top of those clouds, let me not get this wrong, positive charges develop in the top of those clouds, right? And then in the bottom, there's a negative charge that develops. And then if there's a circuit that gets connected to the opposing charge on the ground, you get lightning, right? And that happens a whole bunch here all of the time. And if that lightning strikes something combustible, which in a natural environment, there's a lot of things that are combustible, particularly old, giant, tall, dead pines, you get a fire. So let's talk a little bit more about fire. This is an incredibly blurry picture that the Department of Agricultural Services here in Florida has provided for us that shows ecological succession before, before, immediately after, and then 2 months after a fire. And you can't quite make out what's going on here. So I will decode it a little bit for you. This is a panorama. In that top picture, you have a lot of kind of scrubby saw palmettos, you got some cabbage palms, you obviously have the pines, but what you can't fully see because of the resolution of the picture is that there is a huge amount of just sort of duff and dead growth and just kind of gnarly looking old vines. And you see in that second picture, they have burned that all off. And in the bottom, you can see that there's basically a huge amount of green, right? There's a huge amount of green that is regrowing. And what you would be able to see, if you could see this more closely, is that instead of those saw palmettos on the cabbage palms, more of what that is our native blueberries. There's some little herbaceous stuff. There's wildflowers. Generally speaking, the native plants that we use the most, that I use the most in landscaping, and that we tend to sort of prize as Floridian natives, are super fire dependent. They need fire for a variety of reasons. Generally, it's to scarify the seeds so that the seeds can actually germinate. Like pine cones actually won't open and release seed unless they get hit with a little bit of fire. And there's some super cool stuff about the way that things develop in Florida to adapt to this, right? So we're going to go back to this picture for a second. Think about a pine tree. It's sort of like a cartoon tree. It goes up really, really straight, and then 10, 15 feet above the ground, you start to have branches, and it'll sort of drop those branches, as anyone with one in their yard knows, as it gets older. Well, fires tend to top out around 10 to 15 feet in a system that has had frequent fire burned in it. So what's really cool is if you ever go and see a controlled burn, the tops of the pine trees are fine. The bottom branches might be a little bit singed, but pine trees also are full of resin, right? And they have that really thick layered bark. If you've ever tried to burn a stack of paper, in the middle of the stack of paper won't ignite. That's the same way that pine tree bark works. And then it also has that resin that is released as the tree heats up. They're basically flame retardant trees. It's super amazing how well adapted they are to dealing with fire. Saw palmetto burns off the top, but it's got those big gnarly roots, as you also know if you have one in your yard and have ever tried to get rid of it. The fire doesn't touch the roots for the most part, and it's good to go. All the grasses, all of the herbaceous stuff, that's fine. It burns right off, and all that happens is that the nutrients are cycled from some of that older, woodier growth, and those smaller, more herbaceous things grow back from those increased nutrients in the soil. And there's what's also super cool, right? So in this second tier, a lot of what's coming back here are actually nitrogen fixers. So fire is a catalyst, right? forest fires perform the incredibly important task of cycling nutrients. Like they break down organic chemical bonds into forms that are bioavailable to plants, right? When carbon and silica and all of the key nutrients are bound up in the leaves of a tree, other plants can't really do anything with them, right? But once they burn, in a garden, we use these materials all the time, right? Biochar is an obvious example of something that's created by fire, but all of the key nutrients for the most part are volatilized by fire, which means that they are made more chemically active in forms that plants are more able to break down. And what's really fascinating about nitrogen in particular is that nitrogen is really, really, really unstable in its bioavailable form. So the fire will burn almost all of it off, right? But what happens is that some of the first things to regrow, like most of our pioneer species in Florida, are nitrogen fixers. Like Kunti's a nitrogen fixer, creeping beggarweed's a nitrogen fixer, cassia, deer moss, lichens, these are nitrogen fixers. And so some of the first things to regrow start to pull that atmospheric nitrogen back into the ground. And what ends up happening over time is that the root systems of these ecologies become healthier and healthier and healthier, even if the top of them are getting burned. It's really amazing. And it's a cycle. That's the thing that is important to understand here, right? So historically, almost all of the area of Florida would have been covered by those pine flatwoods, right? And they're incredibly dependent on fire, like we already talked about. So what you're seeing here is kind of that oak overstory, right? So this could be anywhere. But what's happened is that as we have developed, so historically where that would be is maybe it's a slightly elevated piece of land kind of surrounded by wetlands. Maybe it's right against the edge of a lake where fire kind of misses. There's a lot of reasons why something wouldn't catch on fire. But for whatever reason, the places in Florida that aren't prone to fire, this is kind of what you get. And you can see that there's a lot of biodiversity there. You can also see that there's kind of a trail. But if you actually look at the forest floor, you'll notice that there's really less vegetation per square foot than there is in those pine flatwoods. There's actually less undergrowth. And one of the things that's really interesting, I did a course through the University of Gainesville at the Oakland Nature Preserve, which is just south of Lake Apopka. And they are in the process of rehabilitating a lot of their pine flatwoods, but they have some of these areas that are these oak overstories. And what the woman that was teaching the class pointed out is that when you walk through those pine flatwoods, there's just like life. There's birds, there's insects, there's stuff everywhere. When you're in those, there's deer and mammal species and things. When you're in those oak areas, there tends to actually be slightly less biodiversity because there's less food. The oaks actually shade out a lot of the things that exist in these more flame dependent systems that support a lot of that life. So you still get some birds, but they kind of just flit around in the overstory. They're kind of looking for bugs up in the trees. They don't really come down to the ground a lot. And so kind of the takeaway from that is that even in a situation like a climax community, it's not necessarily more biodiverse than the thing that's a little more ephemeral, right? So what I'm saying is you should burn your food forests to the ground, every single one of them. I'm not really saying that. What I am saying is that we're planning forest systems, right? If we understand forests better, then we know that forest systems depend on periodic disturbance. And so when we ask ourselves how we can apply that to our systems, right? What we have to do, sorry, I just got a message. Oh, cool. Yeah, all right, I'll stop talking in a second. This is my next to last slide, I promise. Okay. So we talk about permaculture systems requiring lower inputs, right? And that's true, they do require lower inputs. But when we're in that input role, we've protected, just like our ancestors would have protected the plants that they care about, right? We're protecting the plants that we care about, but by doing that, we're isolating them from fire, we're isolating them from pest pressures and disease pressures and things. And so we take on that role of disturbance, right? And when we take on that role of disturbance, it's an incredibly important role because we have the task of doing what nature does on its own. So that's one of the things that I want to suggest is that, you know, we have this role, naturally speaking, that is incredibly important. We're part of these systems. There's a discussion a lot of times that humans are separate from these ecological systems, that if only we get out of the way, everything would work better. Maybe that's true, But what I think what we want to talk about today is agriculture is a human system, right? And if agriculture is based on replicating natural systems, then we have a role in it. And that role is to manage that disturbance. And so this is just a cool picture that shows you that everything is connected. That's mycelia on the left, that's lightning on the right. Those are both forms of disturbance. So I encourage you, as you are designing your system and managing your system, to look at how you can use some of these thoughts about how forests actually work, about how the history of forest gardening came to be, and about how you can be more deliberate and more thoughtful about encouraging disturbance in your own system. And that is all I've got.
Oh, Greg, you are amazing. You are one of my, I could just listen to you talk for hours. I love your energy. Thank you so much. I really thank you for being here and sharing with us all. How can we get in touch with you? What's your contact for your business, and how do we get more information from you?
The nexus of all of it will probably be connectedlandscapes.com. Yeah, connectedlandscapes.com. It's got all my social media and stuff, which I'm truly awful at doing. So if you really want to get in touch with me, you're welcome to email me, and I'm really good about responding to emails. So if you have food forest questions or business questions or ecology questions or whatever, yeah, feel free to reach out.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I have like a dozen questions from everybody, and I'd love it if you could join us on the Sustainable Kashi community page. The link is over there in the comments right now. And we're going to put all the questions up there, and that'd be an easier way for you to answer each question and kind of put some time on that. So thank you very much. And if you could, we'll go in there, we'll make a post and just talk about what your biggest takeaway for the class was, because this we covered a lot of information here. Thank you. We went way back in time. Thank you so much there, Greg. I want to say thank you to Amy Zelt, our production manager. Thank you very much for putting this call on, making everything happen. There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that happens, that goes on. If you liked what you saw, if you learned anything, feel free to contribute to our PayPal. It's sustainableKashi@gmail.com, and we'll put links over there too if you got something out of this call. Next week, please join us. We got Jeff Trapani joining us. We're going to talk about making a biodiversity salad. He's an excellent presenter, and I'm really looking forward to that as well. Thank you everybody for joining us on this first one. Humans need food forests and forests to survive. We need trees. They give us oxygen, they cycle our nutrients, and we're all interdependent. Everything in the forest is connected, nothing is wasted. And as we move forward and respect that relationship that we have with our forests, we must make the choices to be dedicated to their health for our future and for the future generations. So it's exciting to be working with nature so we can build a regenerative future together. And thank you all for joining us on this important topic, and we look forward to seeing you next week.